There is no narrative control. There's no institutional gated narrative. There's gated institutional, narrative. There is, yeah. It's not like a gin, like Eric Weinstein says, gated institutional narrative. It's not like that. It's the exact opposite of that. There is no attempt to control a narrative. It's the presumption that any narrative that I'm currently aware of is potentially wrong, and I need to hear from you so that I can know how and where to update it. So it's the exact opposite of that. We don't discard something somebody says for being not 100% right. We recognize that maybe it only contains a small amount of signal, so we're not going to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And so Rule Omega is going to buy the field for the treasure it contains, instead of throwing out the field because it's mostly field and only 5% treasure. That's what most people do who are ideologues. We're doing the opposite. We're buying the field for the treasure that it contains. Then we express the signal back in a way that weeds out the noise. So if you're in a dialogue with somebody, they say something, and you might come back with, well, what's really standing out to me is da, 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 da. Tell them this. Can you double click on that for me? Okay, you might say something like that. So by talking back and forth, you're going to incrementally increase the signal through the exchange, through the dialogical exchange, and you're going to raise the level of that signal. Maybe it started off at 1%, and maybe by the time you're finished talking, it's at 6%, but hey, that's more than you had before. And if you have a group of people who are doing this constantly, maybe you can get pretty high with that. Rule Omega is an invitation to do something difficult. In other words, this is a hard thing. We're going to explore the unknown. If we're delving into our unknown set, which we have to realize epistemic humility, beginner's mind. Jesus says, except to be like little children. What are little children? The people who don't know anything, okay? You got to be like a little child. Otherwise, you're not going to enter the kingdom of heaven. You have to start with beginner's mind, first principles thinking, and you're going into your unknown with beginner's mind, and that's a difficult thing to do. Not everybody can do it. It's an invitation to do something difficult and take the risk of not speaking elegantly on the premise that everyone else is doing their absolute level best to hear that which is trying to speak itself through you. Seems like there's a discussion about rightly dividing the word of truth, and for most people, they're thinking of like slicing up the Bible into all the correct divisions, into the right dispensations or something like that. That's how they think of just the Bible. But rightly dividing the word of truth is exactly what we're talking about here. It's on the instead of just looking at the Bible and slicing that up in all the right ways, it's the discernible ability, the discernment ability, or the discernment capacity to be able to hear something in real time from an authentic person, somebody who's a real boy, not somebody who's still a Pinocchio, okay, but somebody who's a real boy, and we can suss out the signal from the noise, rightly divide the word of truth, suss out the signal from the noise when we hear it live, fresh, from an unknown source that doesn't have an authoritative stamp of approval on it, and we can suss that out on the fly. So the problem with the Ephesians 4:16 edification model is that not everybody is ready for it, and the problem and the reason for that is because in our society we're subject to the meaning crisis, and it is producing people who are attached to their belief sets, and we Christians have adopted the way of the world where we are attached to belief sets too. We're doing the same thing the world is doing. We're attaching ourselves to certain belief sets, we're exercising black and white thinking, and we think that everything we think is right, everything that someone else thinks is wrong, and then we can't hear another perspective without getting defensive and then wanting to take everything the other person says and weaponize it against them to make them evil, right? So the goal here, what you want to do, if you want to hear this message, you have to subdue the ego. And some people say transcend it. And the reason, what I have here is I've faded this to like 97% faded. So you can barely see it. It's there. Your ego will never go away. And remember, I'm not talking about being conceited or arrogant. I'm talking about your identity and the things that you've attached yourself to. It'll never go away completely. It has to be there in order for you to interface with other people. Has to be. But what we're going to do is we're going to try to subdue that. We're going to try to separate it from ourselves, recognize that those things are not myself. I mean, how many of you are provisionists? Okay, I see a few hands out there. Were you a provisionist when you were 1.5? No. Were you still you? Yes. Okay, you are not provisionism, and provisionism is not you. So when people say disparaging things about provisionism, don't feel like you're being attacked, because it is not you and you are not it. And that goes for everything. Calvinism. Were you a Calvinist when you were 9 months old? No, you weren't. You had to come across that later. So it is not you. You are not it. Have you ever changed political parties? Have you ever changed religious beliefs? Have you ever gone from one denomination to another? What does that mean? That means that none of those things are you. You can change all of those things. The immutable you is not any of those things of which you can be persuaded and identify with. So, stop identifying with them. Stop it. Learn the things that you're identified to and learn to let them go. Learn to let them go. Otherwise, you cannot relate authentically to people. So a person whose ego is still in full opacity, okay, they cannot be authentic. They are still Pinocchio. They're still, they can't be a Jedi Knight yet. They are Simba having run from Scar and can't come back to the kingdom yet. All right? They're not a real boy. They have all this stuff. So you have to transcend the ego and subdue it and get in right relationship with it. Put all those things aside so that you can relate authentically with people. Because otherwise you cannot. You are not authentic. Only the authentic self can genuinely interact and relate to other people in an authentic, meaningful way. Part of the meaning crisis that's out there is that people cannot interact and relate in a meaningful way because they're interacting and relating ego to ego, none of which is authentic. It's not their authentic self. It's not their true authentic self. It's the things that they've been attached to, substituting as themselves. In other words, it's the same thing as idolatry, but you're doing it to yourself instead of God. You're misrepresenting yourself. You're using a graven image to misrepresent yourself instead of using one to misrepresent God. And you are confused about who you are. Therefore, you cannot be authentic. And you cannot engage in edification protocols if you are not authentic.